Hey, this is Daniel, and my group, Katie Rapp, me, Lily Phelps, and Abdu, we did India and Great Britain. Uh, so we'll begin with a objective 6-point run, rationales of imperialism, how ideologies were used to justify imperialism. So enjoy our video.
The British used the ideas of the white man's burden and cultural superiority to justify their imperialization of India. The author Rudyard Kipling created the poem The White Man's Burden that idealized imperialism and was originally intended to urge the United States to begin imperializing like Great Britain had. But it soon became extremely popular and was used to rally people to support imperialism anywhere in the world, providing an explanation for why it was so important to imperialize. The white man's burden told people that they had a duty to acknowledge the savage ways of the people they were conquering and peacefully help them to reform their communities to look like European societies. Others, such as Herbert Spencer and Thomas Malthus, justified imperialism through social Darwinism, the idea that races are subject to the same natural selection that animals and plants are, and because the Europeans were superior, it was in the best interest of the other nations to let them rule over them. Another such man was Sir Francis Galton, a British scientist who studied eugenics and promoted the idea of an ideal human race, which would be achieved by breeding out the imperfect people.
6.2 State expansion from 1750 to 1900. Territorial expansion and shift of power. In 1757, India was colonized and forcibly taken control of by the British after the Battle of Plassey, who took control of its economy, education, and culture. Britain used this control to increase taxes and break the Indian economy, which resulted in the deaths of millions who couldn't get food because it was shipped away or too expensive. The British also deemed Eastern culture and education primitive and changed it to be British, which alienated Indians from their indigenous culture and history. On this map on the right here, green represents British-controlled India. Pink and pink are the modern India borders. So here's our map of colonization. And as seen by this timeline here, it began with setting up a trading post in the 1600s, later resulting in defeating the Mughal emperor to become the rulers of Bengal, the richest province in India, um, which continued to escalate, obtaining monopoly on the production and sale of opium in Bengal, capture of Delhi, and control of large parts of India. And this continued to escalate more and more until the British had near full control over India. 6.3 Indigenous responses to state expansion from 1750 to 1900. How indigenous people reacted to imperialism. In retaliation to the British rule brought by the British East India Company, the indigenous people of India rebelled against British forces, specifically the Sepoy army assembled by the British from the higher castes of Indian society. This mutiny ended up doing little besides giving the British a new perspective on Indian military and ensuring that the Indian population wouldn't unite against them. A later indigenous reaction, the creation of the Indian National Congress, was much more successful. From 1885 to 1900, the Indian National Congress served mostly to mediate power between India and Britain through reforms. They didn't do anything to limit really the power of Britain, but more to kind of put the power in the middle. This Congress is full of representatives in order to represent the people of India. The British could do nothing in opposed to the Indian National Congress, which would lead independence movements after 1900, after a lot of the leaders were radicalized. This source here is a gazette about one of the many rebellions against British forces. And this is a picture of the Indian National Congress to give you a perspective of how many members there are. Here are my primary sources. If we turn for a moment to look at the effects of this mutiny, one of the first and most obvious will be a better knowledge in Europe of Hindu character, referring to the first effect of the Sepoy rebellion. The assumption that the Hindu and Muslim cannot take common against us, the second cause of the Indian rebellion. Hindu and Muslim are the main groups in the Indian population. So they're saying that these groups can't unite against us and fight us anymore. Success also means that the rule of the British should continue as long as the sun and the moon shall endure, as in the Indian Congress, the Indian National Congress didn't eliminate British rule, but kept it and more mediated it. So many thousands of men have come together from all parts of India, referring to the diversity within the Indian National Congress, It can neither be ignored, despised, nor suppressed in reference to the Indian National Congress, saying the British can't stop it or destroy it.
So we're going over 6.4, the global economic development from 1750 to 1900s, and that's basically the important raw materials and their effect on the economy from the colonized country. So I have two pictures coming up, and I want you to take a look at them, especially their clothing. And I want you to give me some similarities between the pictures and some differences as well. So this is the first picture. You can pause it. I'll stay on here for a couple seconds. And here's the second picture. So now if we look in between the pictures, and if you were looking in the corner, I put some sources. So if we look at the times, the first picture is from around 1764, while the second picture is from around 1909. So both these pictures are about 200 years apart. However, this picture was actually drawn based off of something happening in the 1800s, although it was drawn by an American painter in 1909. So similarity in between these two pictures are both the clothing. All the clothing in both these pictures looks pretty high class, upper class. But the difference is that this picture is from 1764, and it's a picture of a noble party happening in 1764. While this picture is from around the 1800s, and it's a picture of the working class. So the question that we ask is, what happened that allowed Great Britain to suddenly begin selling very high-class clothing at a very low price? And the answer is the East India Company and their raw material exports from India did that. And we got this quote here by Jean-Baptiste Tavernier and his travels in India. So basically he's saying that the English and the Dutch exported large quantities of cotton to India, from India, to Europe. So we're going to talk about the extraction of cotton first. So based on this quote, you can see that there are at least 10 cities, which are Bengal, Baroda, Broach, and Renosari, and 4 other places. And this is once again by Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. And he's talking about how cotton comes from those cities. So those are the only 10, those are like 10 cities mentioned in the book, but there's a lot more that definitely were not mentioned in the book that are producing cotton. So that's the extraction of cotton and how it was farmed. We're moving on to the transportation of cotton. So after that cotton was farmed, the East India Company would often buy the cotton based on this list to the right. Basically, they'd buy the cotton and then move it back to England, right? So an important part of this transportation was the Suez Canal, because before the East India Company would have to go all the way around Africa, which would take a very long time. So basically going through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean Ocean cut the time that it took to go back to England in half, and that earned them a lot more money. We'll get to the East India Company later. But so basically they'd get very cheap cotton from India, and then they'd send it to Britain to like port cities like Liverpool and places like that. Basically this list is a list of goods to be provided in the Bay of Bengal for the ships going out in the year 1730. So what this list is just giving a bunch of cotton and stuff like that, and it's saying that it's going to be sent out to England. Alright, so here we got 2 pictures of factories, and you'll never guess what they're making. They're making cotton textiles. Cool. So anyway, what these after this cotton was transported to England from India, they would send them into factories and then make them into cotton textiles. They were often refined. The refined cotton was then moved into other places like Manchester, and I've got a quote saying that Manchester was called Cottonopolis because there was so much cotton being made there. It was like, yeah. So anyway, yeah, so the refined cotton would often move into these mill towns and get manufactured into clothing and stuff that you could sell, like bed sheets and stuff from there. And then afterwards, they'd have to sell them. And most of the time, often, the manufactured products were sent back to India, so they could resell the manufactured products for a jacked up price. Based on this chart, you can see stuff going into Britain from India was often pretty low. Cotton textiles, at least. However, Britain was selling a lot of cotton textiles to India, and they were often sold pretty cheaply in England as well, as you can see by this little thing. And if you can't read it, it's basically saying that I, uh, a bit of cotton textile is only 20 bucks, which is pretty cheap. So now we're going to talk about the East India Company. Uh, so how did the East India Company get so rich? Well, they were basically like their own country. They got their own flag, and they had a huge army, and this army allowed them to take over India and monopolize it, basically, right? So by monopolizing India, the British East India Company had a monopoly on cheap cotton, and they would be selling all this cheap cotton to India and making loads of money. And so by the time they they were earning too much money, so the British government eventually was they started to regulate the amount of cotton imported, allowed cotton being allowed to import, which was known as the Calico Acts. So this chart is tilted to the right so that you can read it better. But basically, you can see around here they get spiked up and then they spike down immediately afterwards. That's because around 1721 was when the Calico Acts were enacted. So the stocks of the company were at an all-time high, but then they dropped due to the Calico Acts. Around 1774, the Calico Acts were repealed, and then you could see around 1774 there was another huge jump in the stocks company, and they start going back up from this low that they've hit.
6.5 Economic Imperialism from 1750 to the 1900s. Trade and how colonizers used it to their advantage. On the left is an Indian National Congress cartoon published by Punch magazine in 1892. The cartoon represents how, as a result of heavy taxation and the overuse of raw materials, India's resources were being heavily withdrawn by British rule. Within the cartoon, the Indian elephant is chained to taxes such as the salt and land tax. The salt tax was implicated in India by the British East India Company beginning in 1835 as a way to stop the selling and collecting of salt along with facilitating its imports. India was also burdened with different acts that were created with the desire to utilize raw materials of India. An example is the Forest Act, which claimed British control over Indian forests. The basket is represented as the demands of the Indian National Congress. This cartoon, along with all of its elements, is overall displaying the misuse of India under British control for their own gain by taxing India and using their materials to make finished goods. The political cartoon on the right represents the same idea as the other. This image was published in 1893 from the Mirror of British Merchandise and the Hindustani Pictorial News. This represents British rule in India. Like the other image, the elephant is carrying goods as other goods are being loaded onto ships likely to be sailing back to Britain. The sun in the back of the image is a representation of the British Empire, which was considered the empire on which the sun never sets due to its control in many different areas. This was actually a propaganda campaign to promote trade between India and Britain and praise Britain's involvement in India, when in reality the high demand of Indian materials by Britain caused Britain to be successful as they controlled Indian trade. These charts both represent the same data regarding cotton exports from India from 1860 to 1866. When looking at these charts, disregard the Egypt and Brazil data. This data displays the increase in cotton exports by nearly 500 million over 6 years. Under British control, in order to provide for British textile factories, cotton exports out of India increased. The British were using their control to benefit their economy by producing goods using India's raw materials. They would later sell back to India as finished goods for a higher profit. Britain established the export system with India providing a steady supply of goods to Britain, leaving India with shortages of goods. So, as Britain controlled their trade, they profited off of India's goods and sold them back to India. This chart correlates with the previous data sets regarding the trade of exports and imports between India and Britain. This data represents the effects of British control on the Indian textile industry and their trade interactions. Initially, both India and Britain were producing cloth in homes, and India would export cloth to Britain. When Britain took control of India, the British industry began to shift to factory use. Cloth and textiles made in British factories were cheaper than in India, leading to a decrease of Indian cloth exports to Britain. It is clearly shown in the chart that over the span of 31 years, Indian exports decreased, while British exports increased, and therefore increasing British profits. When you take a closer look at the last two columns specifically, you can see the dramatic change between the dominating Indian exports to British exports. This data shows the comparison of Indian and Britain economies over 300 years. GDP is total worth of a nation's production in a certain amount of time. From the 1600s to 1857, the GDP of India decreased while Britain's increased dramatically. Although India's GDP only decreased slightly, Britain's increased greatly over the time period, displaying how Britain's control of India and its trade was more beneficial to Britain's economy than India's. The text explains how the goal and interest of the British East India Company was to create more British trade in India and boost Britain's economy. Britain did so through trade with and control of India. Britain made restrictions on Indian economy and trade in order to benefit themselves, such as preventing Indian cotton goods from competing with British manufacturers, which would suppress India's economy. Then imports from Britain made jobs in India unnecessary and caused people to lose their jobs. This source explains how the British East India Company affected the goods that were traded by India as they shifted from spices to cotton and silk textiles. Since it was a high demanded good that would be exported from India to Britain. It also explains that as the Industrial Revolution grew, instead of finished goods, India would supply Britain with raw materials. So it's a cycle of trade where India would export raw materials to Britain, where they would be finished there, and then would be sold back to India as finished goods, which Britain would ultimately profit more compared to India.
Objectives 6.6 and 6.7 Causes and Effects of Migration in an Interconnected World. Many prominent historical events happened in and involved Great Britain during the period 1750 to 1900. These included the Enlightenment, the abolishment of slavery in England in 1833, and the First and Second Industrial Revolutions. The last three events were the main reasons for Great Britain's quest for new laborers and markets, along with cheap ways to obtain natural resources to manufacture into goods. The increase in manufacturing led to booming urbanization. This caused the working class to resort to living in dirty, cramped, one-room apartments that sprung up around the factories where they worked. However, after the East India Company, a lucrative trading business based out of England began to take off in the 17th and 18th centuries. Many new, better-paying opportunities arose for those in England. The company required translators, diplomats, clerks, soldiers to serve in its new army, and many merchants to fuel the trading. These opportunities were taken up by people like Thomas Roe, an English diplomat in the 17th century who traveled all over Asia and achieved a trading agreement with the Mughal emperor for trading rights with the Islamic empires of the early modern world. Others, such as Stringer Lawrence, the father of the East India Company's military, who migrated to Madras, India by boat and climbed the ranks of the army after his successful transformation of the East India Company's troops. The majority of the people emigrating out of Britain were initially men, but around the late 1880s, middle-class women began to establish themselves in homes in India. This allowed for the creation and nurturing of families by womenfolk. However, with the introduction of women to India, there was also an increase in the gap between native Indian servants employed in the household and their middle-class employers. The Indian servants employed by these families were usually women who would help raise the children, often called ayahs. This method of child-rearing greatly differed from that of the working class in England, where young children often began working as soon as they were able. The introduction of Europeans did not bode too well with the native Indian people due to the increase of suppression that occurred as time went on and more British people came to India. This resulted in a strong sense of nationalism throughout the country.
6.8 Causation in the Imperial Age. As states industrialized, they expanded overseas empires, established new colonies, and transoceanic relationships. Within this political cartoon, Great Britain is displayed in the center with tentacles reaching toward different nations. It shows how Britain already had their hands on lands around the world and were reaching for more. The hand is reaching for Egypt, symbolizing the scramble for Africa. The cartoon is a representation of Britain's imperialistic desires, which they had great success in. It shows Britain gaining territories along different routes, such as the Suez Canal. The symbol of Britain is located in the middle of the water, with the territories surrounding him, which can be considered a demonstration of Britain's power and overseas expansion, as they are connected to all the territories and they are even seen breaking territories. During industrialization, Britain was a leading power. Britain's canals led to easy access to the ocean, and the creation of steam-powered boats made the expansion into colonies much more efficient than prior to industrialization. Plus, through imperialism, Britain gained control over territories and their economies and resources, allowing Britain to get more powerful and lead to the expansion of more colonies. By having territories in essentially every part of the world, trade opportunities were open with each of Britain's colonies, allowing them to gain even more power.
And finally, the works cited must